Hi, this is Paul. Last week I did a video, Can Atheism Save? And a number of people commented on my use of the word save there. And it was quite intentional because, as critical as I am with often how Christians sort of throw out that word as a code word, usually for making the cut after life, in a lot of ways, the word is important. And while this isn't a word that fudges, it is a word that fudges in some ways. People fudge a lot with the word. And part of what I wanted to continue getting at was the definition, the working definition that we have of the word religion, and how this interchanges with the word salvation. If you pay a lot of attention to the word salvation, as I do, partly because, again, of how it's used in the Christian community, you'll hear people use it all the time, even in non-religious contexts or contexts that we don't identify as religious readily or easily. It's a very important word, and like many words, and if you think enough about language and you pay attention to it, you'll notice that we're always using words that are quite ambiguous, they're poorly defined, we're not defining how we're using them, but we all sort of know what we mean by them. That slipperiness of language is very, I can't say interesting now because someone commented on how everything is interesting to me, and that's very true. And so I should pick better words than just interesting, but we should pay attention to this slipperiness of language and how, in fact, we're able to live fairly well in the world even with all this slipperiness. Now, in the last video, again, I had some of the Coleman Hughes, John McWhorter conversation, and I really liked that piece where Coleman is wrestling with the question, can we recapture Dr. King's magic without his religion and the church? That's really what he's asking. And McWhorter, because they're dealing with, say, woke religion, and where Coleman Hughes and McWhorter, when John McWhorter says that sort of the new ascendant chapter of race relations is religion, he obviously means it negatively. And I deeply appreciate how John McWhorter characterizes that, and I agree with him, and I know completely what he says when he says, this is religion, this is Jesus, and he means it in a very atheistic, negative sense, and in his mind, it's not empirical. And whereas I agree with his use of the word religious there, I think there are other ways that the word is appropriate that we're not paying enough attention to. And so Coleman, in a way, asks this question that, again, once you see this and pay attention, you'll find that all over our culture, and for a very long time, people are, in a sense, recognizing the power of religion and say, we need a new one, but this new one has to, and then they have all of these expectations and frames that this new one has to fix what we need to have fixed. It needs to be a religion because we very easily see how religious people are naturally, and any movement that's actually going to gain traction and supremacy and power and will shape and influence the world, any movement like that must have a religious aspect to it. We've been following Bret Weinstein, and his main thing is we have to stop this genocidal spelling bee. And again, that I'm not going to play it in this clip, in this video, but I've played it often, and I think what he lays out in that unbelievable conversation with Alister McGrath, he does it very well, that human beings have sort of a two-track system. We can no longer afford business as usual. We're too powerful, and we'll end life as we know it, but human beings both have a genetic track, but then also the culture track. And this culture track moves at a very different speed than the genetic track, and in fact, over the last not that long, 10,000 years plus, many of the amazing accomplishments and achievements of humanity have been a direct relation of how we've transmitted information in that culture track. We were discussing this at our meetup last Sunday night, and one of the things that it's sometimes hard to get a word in edgewise out of our meetup because it's a pretty aggressive group and the conversations go fast and it's really a tremendous amount of fun. But one of the things that we noted was, human beings, we have these flat stomachs because we don't have all the intestines that, let's say, chimpanzees have because we cook food. And in many ways, we have culturally outsourced parts of our biology. And the cooking of food is an example of that. We cook food, therefore, unlike chimpanzees, we don't need to sit and chew forever on leaves and sit and have eating take up how much of our time. We have agriculture, we have cooking, we have all of these things, and this has continued to shape and change us. And the speed of change in the culture information level is in many ways what completely separates us from the animal kingdom. Now, what Bret wants to do to stop the genocidal spelling bee is we need to rationally determine sustainability and do it or perish. Now, if you watch the video, the monologue preceding this, where I played some of John Gray's lecture, he really brought to the fore Auguste Comte. And there's a couple of really good videos on YouTube. I'm not going to play them. They're very large videos by significant channels. School of Life has one on sociology, Auguste Comte, and also Tom Ritchie on Auguste Comte's positivism. And just as John Gray sort of laid this out in the last video I did, I've got my conversation with Eric Dirksen and my rough draft between that one and this one, but I'll put them both in the secular humanist playlist, so hopefully that'll make it easier for you to find if you didn't watch the previous one, to look at those John Gray lectures. Auguste Comte saw this clearly, and he saw, on one hand, he's the father of positivism, which you hear trotted out by how many new atheists and where, humanity has three stages. First, there was the theological, which was fictitious, and then there was the metaphysical, which is sort of abstract and philosophical, and today we have science, and science must be the measure of all true knowledge. And so when you hear Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris or how many others who like to be out there arguing for science and that science is the way we know things, they are children of Auguste Comte. And when you listen to them and their humanism, as John Gray spelled out very, very, very well, they're also children of him. And in fact, Comte was way ahead of these guys, and he established these temples for humanity where they were going to have daily services, and they were going to replace the Christian calendar with calendars of humanists. And, just look at Bart Campolo and how much of the humanists out there, these people don't hold a candle to this movement. And Comte, at the end of the 19th century, this was a massive movement, and it all went away, which is amazing. The whole thing just sort of collapsed. Now, you would imagine if rationality is so much greater and so much better, and if we can marshal all of this stuff with our intentionality, then surely we can do better. And so when I listen to these celebrity atheists, and now when you look at what Comte did, you begin to say, their program is a failure. It's been tried and failed. And what's alarming is, let's say, compare it to Mormonism. Mormonism arises at, a little bit before, but not that much before. And look at the relative success of Mormonism, of the LDS Church. Now, I have got a lot of love and respect for Mormons that are my friends and all of that, but I don't have a lot of respect for their ancestral narrative with the seeing stones and the golden plates and the angel Moroni and all these things. And in fact, unlike the way a lot of atheists want to look at the stories of the Bible, well, this stuff isn't that old. And you can sort of track this down, and you can try to look for, elements of the lost tribes of Israel and North America. I mean, the whole thing, you just look at it and you say, I can't believe that. But look at the Mormon religion. They're booming all over the world. And this rationalism of Comte, it went nowhere. and died a fairly short death. And, some went to Brazil and some went to other places. But if you compare it to the Mormon church, it's not even close. That is data. What does that say? Now, Sam Harris has his definition of religion as supernatural stories, or faith is belief without evidence. It's just a load of crap. And, because again, look at Comte and say, okay, well, maybe you're right about your definition, but guess what? Which one's going to win humanity? You better put your money on the Mormons because, Comte didn't work. And, he laid this all out for you. He did it more than, Sam Harris did. Well, maybe Sam Harris is going to do it with his app. I don't know. But again, get back to Bret Weinstein's two-track information. You have the gene track and the culture track. And Darwinian fitness is that gene track and its fittedness for survival. And again, watch John Vervaeke's Relevance, Realization, and Darwin. I thought that was one of the best lectures, and that, the way John sort of laid that out just really, turned lights on for me. And it's like, oh, wow, this is really interesting, powerful stuff. But now, what draws or pulls the culture track? And the reason I say pulls, in some ways, the culture track is pulled from the future. And that really sounds weird, but it's our imagination of the future that sort of pulls us into this. And you can hear that when you listen to the new atheists and those who are debating and arguing in that track. And is it glory? Is it religion? In many ways, they're seeking the celestial city, and it's the celestial city of reason. And again, Comte understood human beings and, had a new calendar and had rituals and traditions and understood that people needed solace. And so rationally tried to account for all the human needs of people and lay it all out there and institutionalize it and all of that. And again, dramatic failure. Whereas Mormon religion, whoosh, which seems to say that, in fact, the supernatural aspect, and again, I don't like using that word, but for the sake of communication, I will. The supernatural aspect is not a bug, but a feature. We simply must be pulled into a world that somehow we deeply know we ourselves cannot completely achieve on our own. Now, I think religion, and then we're going to, we're sort of chasing the definition of that word. Religion is what pulls us into that future. And now, sort of like, again, if you go through John's series, the relevance, realization, is there an essence to relevance? And you can't really have an essence to relevance because it's contextual. It has the whole picture integrated into it. Yet it's, and I know all the non-dualists will be jumping in at this part, but it's not just non-dual. It's both dual and non-dual because it's the relationship between the two. Okay, and so. It's hard to find the essence of religion, but it's a word that we use. We know it well enough to use the word even if it's slippery and fudgy for us. And it's somehow analogous to how relevance realization functions via Darwin, I think. It pulls because there is a hazy good future we seek. Now, again, Sam Harris tries to get this as well-being, but is, as Peterson often says of him, he's not taking it seriously. Well-being does not really satisfy. It points in the right direction, but as I'll get in later in the video, it's part of all of our other little internal gyroscopic approximations that try to reach out and navigate by the stars. But in secularism, our skepticism makes us not be able to see the stars. It pulls because there's a hazy good future we seek, but it also pushes because there's a bad future we flee. And again, I think Jordan Peterson has a sense of this in his future authoring program, where the person sits down and you're supposed to, in a sense, envision the good future that you want, but then you also, envision the bad future that you flee. And it's really that same thing. Now, those of you who followed Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis know that he brings in Paul Tillich, and he's a fan of Tillich, and so I listened to Vervaeke's treatment of Tillich, and I hadn't really read any Tillich before then, and so I've been, he's on the list of all the people that I'm taking a look at, but he's germane to this because Tillich wrestles with this question of religion, and the difficulty, again, if we sort of look at Tom Holland's Dominion, Tom Holland, in a video that has really terrible sound, Tom Holland, wrestles with the idea that, in these books, I'm actually reading his book Persian Fire right now, which is just too much fun. It's really hard to put down. I mean, Tom Holland takes some of these great stories of history, like the Greco-Persian War, and just turns it into a Tom Clancy page turner. It's just too much fun. I start reading it, it's like it's like Eric Dirksen said, you feel like a kid with Harry Potter. You just don't want to put the book down. You just keep cheating, and the wife's like, "Are you at that thing again?" "Yeah, honey, it's really good. I can't leave it alone." But Tom Holland makes the point that, in a sense, part of what Jesus does is, and part of what happens in the Middle Ages is that now we have this split world of the seculum and the eternal, and you have the secular and the sacred world, and so we're wrestling with these things now, and in a sense, until Christianity, especially in the colonial period, comes along, people don't know that they have a religion. They're just doing. And then of course the British come along and they're trying to figure this out, and now suddenly there's a religion, and so this, after a few hundred years, we're still wrestling with the concept and trying to figure out what we mean by this. And I think this is part of the reason why you'll see Coleman Hughes or Bret Weinstein or John Vervaeke with his religion that's not a religion, with separation of church and state, this experiment in the American Constitution. We're all wrestling with this and trying to figure out what are we trying to do here. So Tillich weighs in with a definition of religion and that which is of ultimate concern.
The first is his understanding of religion. And this really is fundamental, it's basic to understanding Tillich. He distinguishes effectively between two forms of religion, or two definitions of religion. On the one hand, we have a kind of narrow, official notion of religion, which identifies religion with specific traditions, specific confessions, and the specific.
And again, if you could see this in my conversation with Eric Dirksen, my pastor friend, my church planter friend from Davis, where, after, in kind of our postmodern, even in church planting on the ground, people are wrestling with propositional truth. Is it only propositional truth? And then practice comes in. And so Dirksen, Eric and this group of young church planters that we set loose on the Sacramento area, myself and Kevin Adams. I want to have Kevin Adams on the channel too. They're all dealing with practice. Oh, we have to get down with practice, and that comes up in the woke religion, and that was very much there in liberation theology. We're talking about praxis, and but in a low resolution way. If you're not paying any attention to all the philosophy, you don't understand, well, why are we dealing with practice, and what is religion, and so these are very, very difficult things to wrestle with.
Specific ideas that go along with those. The second notion of religion is a much broader understanding. And here we start to get some of Tillich's own kind of key notions. Yeah? He talks about religion as directedness towards the ultimate, towards the unconditioned. the idea.
Now, if you watch the Vervaeke stuff, he gives a pretty good understanding of Tillich is dealing with some of the stuff in this book that I'm reading, Transubstantiation. I'm going to have a conversation with the author of that. You know, the nominalism realism debate of the Middle Ages. You know, I mean, I know the philosophy here gets deep, but
idea that religion is about our response to that which transcends the everyday. He talks about the idea of ultimate concern. Yeah, so that religion isn't for Tillich to be identified with a particular part of the human life, or in his words at that point in early 20th century, talks about the human spirit. Yeah. And he identifies there Kant as equating religion with morality, Schleiermacher identifying religion with feeling, and he says these are restrictive, yeah? Or even his contemporary Barth, identifying religion with the Word of God, with some kind of narrowly specified form of revelation. Yeah? For Tillich, religion is about this directedness towards the ultimate. And this is manifest, this occurs in all forms of life, in all aspects of human existence. Yeah? So that's the first. The second.
And then he goes on, and you got to jump to the channel to get the rest of it. But that idea of ultimate concern, where it's directing everything, and I think this is really helpful. And if we're going to take this idea of this directed towards the ultimate concern, this is all of human beings. We do this, and it touches all of the various aspects of our life. Then it's kind of fun to revisit Jordan Peterson at Lafayette College in the question and answer about religion, both this guy's question and the next guy's question, and just keep that in mind as we try to put these two pieces together.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. Mm. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be...
Now what's really helpful here is Peterson's not doing philosophy. Peterson is much more like a preacher. He is talking to the masses. He is trying to make this accessible to regular people. And, that's a tremendous gift that Peterson has.
How do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms.
Now, your implicit axioms, well, how do those relate to ultimate concerns?
And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No,
supernatural
I didn't say that.
beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. Like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values, because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms, and the probability that you understand them is very low.
Now, we struggle to articulate those axioms in propositional ways, and that's part of the reason why propositions can never fully seem to exhaust these foundations, yet we at the same time can't really live without them for reasons he's about to go into now.
Because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example...
Now I want to get into the morality, what is morality, quite a bit more. But what he just said there is really important, because I think in some ways morality is this, it's between us, and it's this way that we continue able to react productively. There are all these implicit rules that go on, and we're always stretching these rules to sort of test them and test each other and often try to get our way, but also recognizing that we have to live within these rules in order to actually continue to be in community and work productively. And those rules are also going to have relationships to axioms and to propositions, because that's also part of how we negotiate with each other and figure out how we can work productively. And so much of this stuff is actually simply built in, that we're always looking for signals with each other whether or not we're going to abide by these things. And which is why, if you look on Twitter, for example, and they have all these little videos from homeless people, and part of the point of those videos is that these people who are on the street for reasons of mental illness or something or another, excuse me, these people who are on the street are not safe because, for one reason or another, they are not abiding by the same set of implicit rules that are based on axioms. They can be expressed as propositions one way or another loosely. They're hemmed in often as laws, but right away, even just with a look of an eye, how someone is dressed, how someone behaves, and what should be a common interchange, whether or not they're following the rules, we're very focused on these things. Peterson talks about this quite a bit in his Maps of Meaning. We're very focused on this and quite intuitively able to just grab it and know. And if we find someone is breaking the rules, bang, we react. And our biological systems just react. And this is the way that these, this genetic tract, this matterverse, this biological self is deeply connected with the storyverse and the culture self.
If I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've... that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing. So when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart.
Even yeah, okay. Notice how subtle that is, and it's dismissive. I mean, this is how we communicate with each other. We watch each other carefully. We look for these signals. We're paying attention to status. I mean, we do this all the time, and we don't even know that we're doing it.
Heart of the matter. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. And I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem.
Which, of course, Comte did, which is why he set up what he set up. You have appreciation for the site. I mean, even if you say it's all just story, the story doesn't matter, why, again, does Mormonism far outclass this, temples to humanity that Comte tried to set up?
Problem. You don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that. So they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. I'm a student of religious studies, and currently I'm writing an honors thesis on religious imagery in an Indo-Persian literary genre. There is a poet-philosopher who said the following, which I think you'll like, who, by the way, was a huge fan of Goethe. And he said that in addressing God, he calls him the hidden reality, and he asks the hidden reality to reveal itself, but using the robe of metaphor, because he thinks that metaphor is the only way, stories are the only way that human beings can comprehend, the hidden reality.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've written a lot, you speak a lot about religious stories. I just wanted to ask you, although it may be a very broad question, what is the place of the religious in stories? And
religious is something like the grammatical structure of stories. Like if you go down and you look at what makes a story, that's religious. Yeah, it's not a story otherwise. Like a story is a particular sort of thing. Like in its simplest sense, a story is an account of how to get from point A to point B. It's like a map. But there's a value structure inherent in that, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't go from point A to point B. So just to make the map means to adopt a value structure. But the story is actually more complicated than that, because as you move from point A to point B, processes of radical transformation are often necessary. And the deep stories about the processes of radical transformation that occur as you move from point A to B are basically, they're indistinguishable from religious stories. Now, I think the reason they tend to become religious, let's say, is because it has something to do with the gap between the finite and comprehensible and the infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be...
Now we live in, that's in terms of our consciousness. That's in terms of, I've used this illustration before. I had a friend who had low vision, and he thought he was seeing the room, but he understood that he only could see through this. And so he also was hard of hearing, and so if I would just walk up next to him in the process of the day, it would be like Barbara Eden and I Dream of Jeannie, bang, I'd be right there in the middle of his world. It'd be like, whoa, he'd jump back. And, you can have that if someone walks quietly into a room and there they are. We get startled. And we understand that there's way more in the room than I can ever appreciate, than I could ever know, because my mind is finite. So how do we navigate that which I can actually apprehend in my consciousness and the unbelievable amounts of other data and information out there that I can't pick up or don't pick up or have to limit out or have to represent in other ways in order to grapple with this? How can I manage the interchange of those two things?
To be a border between those, of what we're surrounded, infinite and incomprehensible. It's like we live in the finite and comprehensible, but we're surrounded by the infinite and incomprehensible, and there has to be a border between those, of some, like a mediating border. That's poetry and art. That's narrative. That's religion. And it's that strange metaphorical reality, let's say.
But notice the definition of religion that he uses there. It's hard to nail down. That's the piece that we call religion, that we identify as religion from the place of our secular perspective. That's what we call religion. But religion is that which is of ultimate concern. So religion is also deeper and broader and integrating everything that we act out, because again, in order to act, you implicitly adopt a hierarchy of values, and as he says, maybe you have a whole bunch of fragmentary ones, you haven't really integrated them, but you act that out. And this is part of the reason why so often you seem double-minded, as the Bible says, because, there's this hierarchy of values and there's this hierarchy of values, and so when I'm with Christian people, I act out their hierarchy of values, and when I'm at work in a secular realm, I act out this hierarchy of values, and then we say, that person lacks integrity. They haven't brought their hierarchy of values together. You recognize that there are conflicts between these two systems, and so you're trying to work these things out, and that then gets expressed in your action. And this is all that what he's talking about here.
That's not factual, and it's not comprehensible, but that's not infinitely incomprehensible either.
See, it's not factual in this sliver of scientific acting that we must do, and fact is this tiny little. I've talked about it before, sort of like an Amazon box, a factual. Oh, okay. But we seem very comfortable with that, because actually we're comfortable with that because of the narrative that we've embedded it within in modernity, and now that, of course, is passing away. So, but what he's getting at, it's not sort of the common, the at-handness that is manipulable by us, but there's the way more out there, and so something has to do it, and so that then gets encoded in story. And Peterson's, of course, getting a lot of this from Jung, and this is sort of what I've picked up in terms of, again, back to Jung's story of working in the mental hospital when the other doctors say, don't talk to those crazy people, they're crazy. And Jung's like, what am I going to do here? What are we here for? We're supposed to help them. And he starts listening to them, and he begins to realize that the stories that they say are connected with Bible stories, religious stories, mythologies, those things out there. And you begin to wonder, why that strange correlation? If they're just crazy and the wiring is bad, shouldn't everything just sort of be random? But if your CPU or your motherboard has a problem in your computer doesn't work at all. Well, we're a lot more fail-safe than that. But then he begins to notice correlation, and so I wonder, and this is in very many ways what pastoral care is all about. I wonder if we can achieve greater health, whatever that means, if we can achieve greater health by trying to work on the relationship between the story out there and the story in here. And by working on those two things, maybe I can actually, in a sense, be better in touch with the world out there. And the world out there isn't just the stuff of the matterverse, because it's so thick with other human beings, and so thick relationally, and so thick in terms of what's going on, that I've got to be in sync with the cultural story. And I've got to be in sync with the great cultural stories that go back thousands of years, because those are within the individual culture stories. And this whole thing is just going on constantly, and we actually manage it, but we manage it in the storyverse. You can't manage it any other way, which is why, for all of the imagined positivism by the receding positivism by the celebrity atheists, it's just, it doesn't work, and it can't work, and it never will work. Which is why, Mormonism kicks the butt of the temple of humanity.
It's a bridge between the two. So, and as you move closer to the infinite and incomprehensible across that bridge, you get farther and farther away from what you understand, right? But how could it be otherwise? Given that you're finite, you are a finite being, surrounded by what's infinite and incomprehensible.
And that was his critique of the strict rationalists, that they can't, that it's hard for them to make this, that's where poets come in, and that's where artists come in. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I learned a lot of this from Jung, because Jung's idea was that rationality is embedded in a dream. Like there's the infinite unknowable, and then there's the dream. And then inside the dream is the rational domain. And I believe that to be the case. Why else would we dream? We have to dream. If we don't dream, we go insane. It doesn't take very long. And so there's an element of poetic conceptualization that grounds us. And it has to be taken seriously. The rational critics of dreams think about them as random neural activity. It's like there's nothing... When you look at a TV screen that's not on a channel, that's random. When you dream something complex and sophisticated, that's not random. So, so the metaphor surrounds us, let's say. And we can critique it rationally, and we can undermine it, but there's real danger in that. So...
Sometimes pull up a slide. It's like, what was I thinking when I made this slide? So we've got the great Willy Wonka meme that someone made in the Discord. Okay, now I remember what I was going to talk about. We live in a context where you gain status by being secular. Now, this is in certain places of certain parts of the world. Very true of a secular university. Not true of your church, not true of your Christian day school or your Christian college, maybe not true of going to dinner at your mother's. Aaron Rodgers has been in the newspaper because Danica Patrick, his new girlfriend, on the podcast where he started criticizing the religion that he was raised in. And surprise, surprise, parents aren't happy. And so it makes for uncomfortable dinners over the Thanksgiving table. And so here you have these contexts, these realms, which are, it's transmitted relationally, and it seeps into the walls, and it's embedded and encoded in the decor of the house. I mean, we're that subtle and we're that pervasive that there's a sociology of the secular and the sociology of the sacred. And what we so often do is we confuse the abstract with the ultimate. That we think, that's abstract, so it's ultimate. No, that's not really necessarily how it is. We naturally split between the matterverse and the storyverse. Remember, we're two-track beings, and these things are deeply intertwined. Yet we sort of distinguish between them for the sake of, let's perhaps what the scientific revolution and modernity has afforded us. And this is perhaps this loss of participation that Owen Barfield was talking about. And we're looking at, you have ancient participation, original participation, this loss of participation, and then final participation when the two will be wholly put back together. So we have Weinstein's two threads, but they're both essential to humanity. One can't live without the other, and Bret makes that point passionately, and he's exactly right. They must come together at all layers, and in many ways, that's always what religion is trying to do. And so again, reading that book on transubstantiation, this is why the sacrament, the body of Christ, becomes such a pivot point in the middle of the Protestant Reformation. There it all is. It's how do heaven and earth connect? And in some ways, Luther's Reformation was a psychologizing, and I would assert a necessary psychologizing of this in order to address the corruption. And, it stands to reason, but these things can't stay separate forever. They have to come together. And so the Protestant reformers try in many ways to put them back together. And the corruption, in a sense, had been earlier sort of expressed by the religio, as Tom Holland notes. And now you have the religious monks. You have the two-speed religion, where you have ordinary people in the secular, and then the sacred people who are in the monastery, and they're doing things together. And then, of course, John Calvin comes around and wants to make the entire city of Geneva holy, but he's always bumping up against, all of these issues. And, and wanting to do it in a way that didn't express the totalitarian impulses that in fact drove Martin Luther into the Reformation that he would express. So they must come together, and they seek to come together, and this is why all of this stuff is inevitable. Now C.S. Lewis, in parsing this stuff out, very much wrestled with this, and actually you don't find this so much in C.S. Lewis's writing, but in another book of his, not of his, by Sheldon Van Auken, which is really an amazing book called A Severe Mercy. This is a letter from Lewis to Sheldon Van Auken, and they were friends, and there were a number of letters from Lewis that Sheldon put in his book. I don't agree with your picture of the history of religion. Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, and others elaborating an original simplicity. I believe Buddhism to be a simplification of Hinduism, and Islam to be a simplification of Christianity. Clear, lucid, transparent, simple religion, Tao plus shadowy, ethical God in the background, is a late development, usually arising among highly educated people in great cities. What you really start with is ritual, myth, and mystery. Now again, the people working the temples of Persia or Greece or Egypt, they do so in a sense innocently of sort of the two of the split that comes in the loss of participation in Barfield's middle position. It's all initial participatory, and so when the runner who ran from the Battle of Marathon to try and get the Spartans up there for the battle, when he's on his way back, discouraged that the Spartans they're not going to break off their festival for a battle, that would be suicide, and we secularists think, oh no, you should. You'd better, don't worry about your little ceremony. No, the ceremony is the foundation for life for the Spartans. And so on the way back, he bumps into the god Pan, and Pan gives him a good word, and the Athenians win the Battle of Marathon. Panic is from Pan. I mean, all this stuff is built in. So you had your original participation, and they're in a sense innocent of the split that will come. And in fact, this split doesn't just come in the Protestant Reformation. You can read the tensions in the Old Testament amongst the prophets. It's obedience, not sacrifice, that I want. You can read the tensions when you read Jesus, where he says it's not what goes into a man's mouth that makes him holy, but what comes out of a mouth. And it's in bright lights then in Luther's Reformation. But they're always dealing with these tensions. And so here Lewis is dealing with them. What you really start with is ritual, mystery, and myth. And of course, Lewis, good friend of Owen Barfield in the Great War, had worked through these kinds of things. The death and return of Balder or Osiris, the dances, the initiation, the sacrifices, the divine kings. Native American, when you put on the mask and you put on the costume, even the language that we use, we can't get away from, we become the god. What does that mean? Over and against, those are the philosophers. Aristotle or Confucius, hardly religious at all. What sense is Lewis using of the word religious there? He's using that sort of common sense. A church is religious in the way that the courthouse is not supposed to be religious. Better take down that 10 Commandments. They'd better take down that 10 Commandments statue. You can see we're always dealing with these tensions, and sort of what happens in American politics is that, we set it up in a way to in a sense, heighten the tension, but recognize the tension when we're dealing with it. Back to Lewis. The two systems in which the mysteries and philosophies come together are Hinduism and Christianity. There you get both the metaphysics and the cult, continuous with the primeval cults. That is why my first step was to be sure, he's talking about his own conversion, that is why my first step was to be sure that one or the other of these had the answer. For the reality, and I would argue that it could be, Hinduism does Hinduism actually exist? I mean, it's the religion of the people of India. Well, how many religions is it really? I mean, is it the metadivine realm, or is it a theism? I'm not going to be able to answer that for you. This is why my first step was to be sure that one or the other of these had the answer. For reality can't be one that appeals either only to savages, in a sense original participation, or only to the highbrows, divorce of participation. Real things aren't like that. For example, matter is the most obvious thing you meet. Milk, chocolates, apples, and also the object of quantum physics. In other words, in a sense, when you hold an apple, there's potentially no divorce. Okay? But what does the apple mean? What does the bread and the wine mean? What does the elevated consecrated host mean? I mean, this is where we're struggling in the middle here. There's no question of just a crowd of disconnected religions. The choice is between A, the materialist worldview, which I can't believe, says Lewis, B, the real archaic primitive religions, which are not moral enough. Now, Lewis has his own moral, he's dealing with his same contemporary morality, but again, partly what happens when you get deep within, I can't avoid using the word, deep within a religious tradition, is that the morality of that religious tradition starts to inform the present moral matrix that you're swimming within. And that's going to cause tensions within the larger group. And you can see those tensions all the time played out in the conservative and progressive magazines in American culture. This is the in a sense part of the central tension surrounding Donald Trump. The claimed fulfillment of them in Hinduism. Now pay attention. Lewis is looking for fulfillment of these issues. The claimed fulfillment of these in Hinduism and the claimed fulfillment of these in Christianity. But the weakness of Hinduism is that it doesn't really join the two strands. And he says, God made man, bread His presence right there in the bread and the wine, the strands are joined. But the weakness of Hinduism is that it doesn't really join the two strands. Unredeemably savage religion goes on in the village. The hermit philosophizes in the forest, and neither really interferes with the other. And in this sense, Lewis, I think, is a Protestant leaning towards the resolution of Protestants and Catholics. And we'll throw the Orthodox in there too. He's leaning in towards the consummation of all things and the oneness of the church and the resolution of all of these tensions. It is only Christianity which compels the highbrow like me to participate in a ritual blood feast, and also compels a Central African convert to attempt an enlightened universal code of ethics. So for Lewis, all of these various things come together in Christianity, which is why he goes there. So let's deal with this word saved. Religion is the question of how to save the world. Well, what do we mean by saving? Saving from what? Does Sam Harris's well-being really get us there? We try to imagine a perfect world. Now, if you sit down and you think about that long enough, you begin to realize this is not easy. And in fact, well, Bret Weinstein, well, we want to have a sustainable world. Well, that's sort of a materialist knockoff of eternity in some ways. And Coleman Hughes's, reconciliation of racial strife, well, that's an attempt to see the, peace on earth. But if you really start to try to imagine it, it's a lot harder than many of us imagine it would be. And this is part of the reason why Peter Kreeft makes this point often when it comes to his treatment of Aslan in the Narnia Chronicles, that it's far easier and often very interesting for us to see representations in literature and film of evil than the good. In fact, the good is so difficult to represent, we often don't believe it, and we critique it, and we abandon it, whereas we find representations of evil more engaging, and that question of engagement is a tell that we are learning from it, whereas it's extremely difficult to represent the ultimate. But we're always trying to get there. It's an ultimate concern. We're being pulled by it into the future. And most of our impulses are negations or simplistic comparisons, sort of like A/B testing here within the iron box of secularism. Food is better than hunger, joy instead of nihilism, security instead of fear, health instead of illness, life instead of death, freedom instead of loss of agency. And so we can see those comparisons, but as we work them and as they get pushed into the future and pushed into bigger and broader spaces, and as the complexity of the world bears on in them, it's enormously difficult to sort of represent them and imagine them. And this, if you go back to my sermon last week, I think I posted it on the church channel. This is why, people like Jesus become so endlessly interesting, because he seems to bring strength and kindness into a person, into one. And so you take these things, as Jonathan Edwards talked about, these diverse excellencies. I should pull up that slide. This is what Tim Keller got from Jonathan Edwards, and you can find it in his book Making Sense of God, and I read it in last week's rough draft, and it was in my sermon. Particularly impressive to the readers over the centuries has been what one writer has called an admirable conjunction of diverse excellencies in Jesus Christ. That is, in him we see qualities and virtues that would ordinarily consider incompatible in the same person. We would never think they could be combined, but because they are strikingly beautiful. Jesus combines high majesty with the greatest humility. He joins the strongest commitment to justice with astonishing mercy and grace. And he reveals a transcendent self-sufficiency and yet entire trust in and reliance upon his heavenly Father. We are surprised to see tenderness without any weakness, boldness without harshness, humility without any uncertainty. We couldn't do this without words, but we have a sense when we read this that words aren't fully capturing it. Indeed, accompanied by a towering confidence, readers can discover for themselves his unbending convictions but complete approachability, his insistence on truth but always bathed in love, his power without insensitivity, integrity without rigidity, passion without prejudice. And this is part of a sermon where I talk about the Lamb of God. You take these two ideas, God, this power, domination, winning, and Lamb is prey, and you put them together. Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. How can a Lamb of God do this? And then you read in the testimony of the patriarchs this strange image where you have all the beasts of the earth attacking a lamb, and the lamb triumphs. And so we can. And this is where, again, the stories and the imageries, and this is why the book of Revelation, artists try to capture it and put it into things, but, put it into literalistic pictures, but you can't. A tree that grows on both sides of a mighty river. Well, how can that happen? And this is where, of course, you get into Jonathan Peugeot's iconography, where you're trying to represent things, and that's why Jonathan Peugeot, for us literalists, becomes sort of an interpreter and says, well, this means this, and this means this, and this means this, but the explanation cannot exhaust the image, and even the image that we can express in stone does not exhaust what the image is pointing to. And this is again with Transfiguration, where you get into Jonathan Peugeot, or John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro. You get into that question of sign. Well, it's again when I get into the Transfiguration, the transubstantiation book. The question of nominalism and realism. Does that sign? How does that sign participate in the reality? Okay, so we're dealing with all of those things. Now, American dreams of well-being are so shallow in my conversation with Byrne Power. Again, Byrne Power I can't believe he only has 323 subscribers on his site. He's such a source of wisdom and such a resource in terms of understanding the art and imagery that he's lived through in his lifetime. Fun has become the summum bonum of American culture, which betrays our shallowness. Hallmark movies shoot for romance and nostalgia, and that's the best we can do. Diversion is the main vehicle. If we can't capture it, or at least have a representation that enthralls us sufficiently, let's just feast on junk food. Thrills and action, sex and drug escapism, streaming TV, abdication, living in a stream of others' curated stories better than our own. I was struck when I read Charles Taylor's A Secular Age how he tries to grapple with this. And that was very interesting, looking at a philosopher. Okay, what words will you use in an analytical format to try to get at something as vivid and bright as what you find in, say, the Book of Revelation or the Lamb of God? Charles Taylor here. In the last chapter, I described various narratives of secularity. I told these stories partly to show that there is no apodictic proof here, but also to show what is attractive to its proponents about various forms of unbelief. As I indicated in the previous section, I believe there is no escaping some version of what I call, in an earlier discussion, fullness. That's the word that he's using, and he's using it because how do we? I would probably use glory. Fullness. He wants it to be more experiential. Lewis maybe would use joy or sensuch. Fullness. For any livable understanding of human life, there must be some way in which this life looks good, whole, proper, really being lived as it should. That would be, Sam Harris is trying to use well-being for that. The other absence of such would leave us in abject, unbearable despair. So it's not that unbelief shuns Christian ideas of fullness for nothing at all. It has its own version. It must. We can't live without it. We can't help but be religious in the sense of ultimate concern pulling us into the future. The swirling debate between belief and unbelief, as well as between different versions of each, can therefore be seen as a debate about what real fullness consists in. The debate has two facets. Take a debate between two kinds of unbelief. On one hand, a standard utilitarian position. It's interesting that Comte was influenced on John Stuart Mill, and the relationship between them is fascinating. Take a debate between two kinds of unbelief. One on hand, a standard utilitarian position. Beings have certain needs and desires. For instance, prosperity, a family where people grow up healthy and adjusted, good times with friends and family. And against this, we have one of heroic propositions. And this is exactly where we see Peterson coming into, because what does he sort of bring up that sort of jump starts a generation of young men? It's the heroic, because they're living in affluence, and they can be 30 years old, still living off the generosity of parents who are scratching their head wondering, when will he grow up? And as I mentioned in the other thing, he in a sense infused these young men with ego or agency. It was like hit them with a cattle prod and said, wake up, be a hero, be an agent. Of course, Peterson wasn't the only one or the first one to do that. But so you have sort of let's meet all the needs and then we'll be happy. Really? Then why are people in fat communities that have terrific security offing themselves? But it's the meaning crisis. Let me read that sentence again. Take a debate between two kinds of unbelief. On one hand, a standard utilitarian position. Beings have certain needs and desires. For instance, prosperity, a family where people grow up healthy and adjusted, good times with friends and family. And against this, we have one of heroic positions, which in our culture often owe a great deal to Friedrich Nietzsche. For example, an ordinary happiness is a pitiable comfort. There is something much higher in life. Or it might be the heroic humanism of Dr. I don't know who this is, Reich and Camus' La Peste. I mean, Taylor is a Canadian, and so he's fluent in French, and I am not. Who acts for the good of his fellow creatures, in spite of the absurd, even of the last instance, the ultimate futility of such actions. So on one level, it seems that the heroic critique, too, say, of a Humean, is that the satisfaction she seeks for self and others are real, but there is something higher in life which she is missing out on. But the critique in the other direction seems to take up a different issue. It calls into question the supposed satisfaction itself. The sense of a high that the heroic figure finds in his action is seen as suspect. And going on, you can continue reading Taylor from there. The Bible itself, when it tries to talk about the ideal, the eschaton, the ultimate, uses images. And this is where Jonathan Peugeot comes in. I think, part of it's so interesting talking to people about Jonathan, because on one hand, you get the sense of, wow, I really like what he's doing, but I don't understand him at all. Well, and this is exactly what some do and some don't, obviously, but this is exactly sort of what John is doing. And so Jonathan Peugeot is sort of a burning bush out there, and people look at him and, well, there's something there and I'm getting something from it, but I don't exactly know why, because he's dealing in symbolism and he's dealing in images, and he's an artist. And look at how the Bible does this. The lamb will lay down with the lion, and the tree of life and the water of life and the New Jerusalem, and there'll be no need for sun because the Lord's presence will be the light in the city, and there'll be no sea, but yet there's a sea of crystal. And again and again in the book of Revelation, people keep trying to draw it because they have said, well, it's imagery, I ought to be able to draw it. But then when they make the drawing, it's like, you can't really draw it. It's sort of, again, like a dream. It's evocative rather than descriptive. And so it's right there at the margin, like Peterson was talking about. Now Lewis plays on this at the beginning of Mere Christianity, which was taken from some radio shows that he had done during the Second World War in England, and he has this argument from desire. You can hear Peter Kreeft, not Peter De Vries. There's an interesting little slip. Peter Kreeft. He debated on Unbelievable, whether how good is the argument of desire, and you can find that in the archives, Saturday, July 20, 2013, on Justin Brierly's radio program. Lewis says we long for a world we've never seen, and so this is the section of, Lewis. Again, Lewis's life, a little short biography. He loses his mother at age 6. And his mother was the emotional warmth of the household, and his father just simply did not know what to do with himself or his 2 young boys, so sends them to boarding school. And Warney loves it. Warney eventually goes into the military. He loves it. Lewis hates it. Suffers abuse in these boarding schools. Can't stand his father. Can't stand the Anglican religion. Is doesn't know why. He's angry. He's lost his mother. He lost the emotional center of his life. And then, then he finds joy in mythology. He finds joy in the heroic. But then he goes into World War I, and not heroic, has exactly the right kind of wound that saves him his life and takes him out of action. And his best friend dies, and, has the situation with Mrs. Moore. But for Lewis, it's the true myth. He's got to have it all. It's got to be put together for Lewis. He can't have it any other way. That's why, as he says in the passage that I read, it's got to come together. He's got to have the sense of final participation. And he's not going to live in this world where people say, oh yeah, you can dream of that, but you'll never taste it. You'll never know it. You'll never see it. You'll never see the real Narnia. Is it just a simple negation? Or somehow do we have a deep sense of how things should be? Is there really a real and true Narnia? I was really struck by some of the last lectures that John Vervaeke had of the second self, and maybe I should re-listen to those before I talk to him again, because because not only the second self, but the second world. At the end of the Bible, there's the new heaven and the new earth coming down from heaven. And, the church is the bride and Jesus is the bridegroom. And the reconciliation of heaven and earth is consummation. And consummation, of course, links us to the sex act and marriage bed and, the sum of all of our dreams. And Lewis, in a sense, says, I'm not going to live without really hoping and really believing and LARPing in the midst of the church with people with squeaky shoes and music he can't stand and priests who only know half of what he knows, but figuring out how that works. In my videos, I try to figure out, why am I still a Christian? And I did that video, and how can I put this stuff into words? And maybe right now my best answer is I'm sort of a pragmatic Darwinian version of Pascal's wager. If we are living in a materialist or a meta-divine realm, and evolution has clearly demonstrated that religiosity is adaptive, I'm going to be religious. I have to navigate the knowable and the unknowable. We all have to navigate that. To live in the midst of the knowable and the unknowable and say, I can know anything. I do know everything. That foolishness I won't abide. But then why not be religious if all of this is true? And again, the comparison between the Mormon church and the Temple of Humanity. Temple of Humanity, well, got kind of going. You can find Sunday assemblies around, and, the Universalists are still going at it, and, they're trying to make it work, but not like the Mormons. The Mormons kick their butt in terms of adherence and finding people. And again, I'm not one who has a lot of respect for the Mormon stories. I'm not a Mormon, but in terms of how well people take to it, well, they take to it really well. And so, okay, I'll be religious, but what will my religion look like? Which religion? Well, I'm going to be a pragmatic Darwinian worker of, or a mutator of Pascal's wager. I'm probably going to pick an old one because it's been around the block. It's battle tested. It has rich, deep resources. There are plenty of books. There are plenty of people. I want to pick a big one. I want to pick one where there's an outlet in my neighborhood, where there's a community of people that I can try this out in and with, that I can embed myself within. Jesus' ethic, now Lewis, he tried to work it with his morality. And, via Tom Holland, well, Jesus' morality has really, in many ways, been a powerful contender for the last 2,000 years. It's sneakily willing, even when people say, I don't believe that, Jesus, yet they embrace his moral system. We can hardly escape it. That's the power of the book Dominion, where it shows how often Jesus is on both sides of the fight. And no matter who wins, Jesus still influences and colonizes. And this is what I see, right now churches are being torn apart by the question of same-sex marriage. But, right away I saw in that debate, well, people who are purporting same-sex marriage, that's very Jesus-y. Well, also, standing against it is very Jesus-y. Jesus influences us on both sides of it. What's going on with that? And you see it again and again and again. And, there are some Jesus ideas in Marxism. And you read Acts 2 or Acts 4 and you say, oh, this, sharing all things in common. That's not really Marxism, but certain kinds of communism, is that Jesus-y? Jesus just seems to win. And then, of course, when Marxist communist turns into a bloodbath, we say, well, maybe we'll not include the bloodbath part. And maybe we'll not include some of these other parts. But Jesus had his influence there too. One might lead to, it might lead to death, this following Jesus, but that's a matter of a few years. Evolutionarily speaking, even in terms of human culture. If I die at 45 or 65 of 85, it means a lot to me. It means a lot to my family. But again, the rough draft for Sunday that I just will be posting on Saturday, and I'm going to post this on Monday, Jesus lives 33 years, and 30 of the years we know nothing about. What kind of economics does God use? Love your neighbor as yourself. When we hear that, say, that's the morality. That's all we need is love. I loved the love chapter in Dominion. I thought that chapter was a masterpiece. Love your neighbor as yourself. Wow, Pastor, that sounds beautiful. But if you live that way, it's really costly. Yeah, might cost you your life. It'll cost you your money. It'll cost you your time. All the way up and down, up to and including your enemies. Who is your neighbor? Well, who knows? Read the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, a happy life. What do I mean a happy life? Imagining that, in fact, that misery, deliverance, gratitude, that I've been rescued from my poor moral performance, and Christ's moral performance has been offered me instead. And that well, what is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but have been bought, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, was fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood, and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. First question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism. These things fill me with joy. I don't know why a materialist says, oh, you ought not to believe him. What, pride? Really? I looking at your system, I see no ought from you that brings me to not be in the words of John Piper, a Christian hedonist. Generosity towards my neighbor. So it's not a selfishness that sets my needs up against my neighbor. It's a joy of meeting the needs of my neighbor. We're impressed by how this works for the homeless and the philosopher. Let's add this on top of the pile. What if the resurrection is true? What if Jesus' morality, which was exemplified and acted out in the cross and then in the resurrection and ascension, what if it is in fact a true myth? What if it's true? What if he rose from the dead? What if the disciples weren't lying? What if Jesus, I don't care to go so pilot anything. It's you, my friends, that I want you to know I am alive. So he shows up with his friends. And the road to Emmaus, he breaks bread. This is how he's the most influential person in all of human history. What if it's a true myth? Why not want it to be true? Why not live as if it's true? So that's my pragmatic Darwinian version of Pascal's wager.